Can you move any slower, old man? The trucker's voice dripped with contempt as Frank Morrison shuffled toward his usual booth. It was the third time that week someone had mocked him for his limp, his slow movements, his very existence. Frank didn't respond. He'd learned decades ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. But when two armed men burst through Betty's diner door at 6:47 a.m., demanding money and taking hostages, the 78-year-old man everyone had dismissed as harmless was about to remind them that age doesn't erase training. It just makes you more patient about when to use it. Welcome to Open Book Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of forgotten heroes, earned respect, and a soldier who never stopped being dangerous, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Betty's Diner sat alongside Highway 89 in rural Montana, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals gathered for gossip. The building was original 1950s, chrome and red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox that still played Patsy Cline if you fed it quarters. Frank Morrison had been coming to Betty's for 15 years, ever since he'd retired to Montana from a life he didn't talk about. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd park his old Ford pickup in the same spot, walk through the same door, and sit in the same booth by the window. Booth number 7, corner position, back to the wall, clear sight lines to both entrances, view of the parking lot. Old habits. Frank was 78 years old now. His hair had gone completely white, his face was weathered like old leather, and he moved slowly. A combination of age, arthritis, and old injuries that had never quite healed right. His left leg had a pronounced limp from shrapnel that doctors had never fully removed. His hands trembled slightly when he wasn't concentrating. To everyone at Betty's, he was just the old guy in the corner. A fixture, like the jukebox or the faded Route 66 signs on the walls. Present but not really seen, existing in the background while life happened around him. The morning waitress, Cindy, was 23 and had worked at Betty's for 2 years. She knew Frank's order by heart: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, but she'd never learned his last name. Just called him Hon or Sweetie, in that generic way you address elderly customers you don't really see as people. "Morning, Hon," she'd say, sliding his coffee across the table without making eye contact. "Usual?" "Please," Frank would reply quietly. He always said please and thank you. Always left a 20% tip exactly. Always finished his meal in 20 minutes and left by 6:45 a.m. The other regulars barely acknowledged him. Earl, the mechanic who came in at 6:15, would nod vaguely in Frank's direction, but never spoke to him. The truckers who stopped in for quick meals would often complain about the slow old guy blocking their path to the bathroom or taking too long to count out exact change. This morning, Thursday, October 12th, had started like any other. Frank arrived at 6:00 a.m., parked his truck, and began his slow walk to the door. His leg was particularly stiff today, making his limp more pronounced. A trucker, big man, late 30s, wearing a Peterbilt cap, was coming out as Frank was going in. The man made an exaggerated show of holding the door, tapping his foot impatiently as Frank shuffled through. "Can you move any slower, old man?" The words were loud enough for everyone inside to hear, followed by laughter from the trucker's companion. Frank didn't respond. Didn't even look at them. He'd been called worse things in worse places by more dangerous men. Some battles weren't worth fighting. He made his way to booth 7, sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body hurt most days, and unfolded his newspaper. The Billings Gazette, delivered to the diner every morning so Frank could read it with his coffee. Cindy brought his coffee without being asked. "Usual, hun?" "Please." The diner was moderately busy. Earl at the counter. 3 truckers in a booth near the entrance. A young couple, tourists probably, studying a map. Betty herself was in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the service window as she called out orders. Normal Thursday morning at Betty's diner. Frank read his paper, sipped his coffee, and noticed things, always noticing. The way the young couple kept glancing at the door nervously. The truck outside that had been idling in the parking lot for 15 minutes with no one getting out. The way the driver's hands kept moving to check something in his jacket. 40 years ago, Frank would have called this in. Suspicious activity, possible threat assessment, recommend surveillance. But Frank Morrison wasn't Staff Sergeant Morrison anymore. He was just an old man drinking coffee, and nobody wanted to hear about his paranoid observations. His eggs arrived. He ate slowly, methodically, keeping the newspaper propped up as cover while his eyes tracked the parking lot through the window. The truck driver's door opened. 2 men got out, mid-20s, worn clothing, moving with the jerky energy of either drugs or adrenaline. Both wore jackets too heavy for the weather. Both kept their right hands near their waistbands. Frank set down his fork, picked up his coffee with his left hand, his trembling hand, and took a sip. His right hand, hidden under the table, was perfectly steady. Some habits didn't fade, no matter how old you got. At 6:47 a.m., the 2 men pushed through the door. One immediately moved to block it. The other pulled a gun, a revolver, looked like a .38, and fired once into the ceiling. Everybody stay calm and nobody gets hurt. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small diner. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. Cindy dropped a coffee pot and it shattered on the floor. The tourist woman screamed. Earl started to stand up, and the second gunman, the one at the door, pulled out his own weapon. I said, "Stay calm. Hands on the tables where we can see them." The first gunman, clearly the leader, swept the diner with his eyes and his weapon. Nervous, twitchy, probably his first armed robbery. That made him more dangerous, not less. Scared criminals made mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. "You!" He pointed at Betty, who'd emerged from the kitchen. "Register! Empty it! Now!" Betty was in her 60s, had owned this diner for 30 years. She'd seen hard times, hard people. She didn't panic. She walked calmly to the register and started pulling out bills with shaking but controlled hands. The gunman kept talking, his voice high-pitched with adrenaline. "Phones! Everyone put your phones on the tables." "Do it now!" Frank slowly pulled his phone from his pocket. An old flip phone, the kind they gave to elderly people who couldn't figure out smartphones, and placed it on the table. His movements were careful, deliberate, non-threatening. The last thing you wanted in a hostage situation was to startle an armed man with an itchy trigger finger. The second gunman was collecting phones, dumping them into a bag. When he got to Frank's booth, he barely glanced at the old man. "Wallet, too, Grandpa." Frank reached for his wallet with his trembling left hand. As he pulled it out, some cards fell on the floor. Insurance card, library card. The kind of clumsy mistake an old man would make. "Jesus, you're useless," the gunman muttered, kicking the cards away. "Keep the wallet. I don't want your Social Security money." He moved on, dismissing Frank entirely. In his assessment, the old man in the corner wasn't a threat, wasn't worth attention. Just another elderly person, slow and harmless. Exactly what Frank wanted him to think. While the second gunman collected phones and valuables, the leader was getting increasingly agitated. The register hadn't contained as much money as he'd expected, maybe $300. Not enough for whatever they needed it for. That's it? That's all you got? It's 6 a.m., Betty said evenly. Haven't had enough customers yet to have more. Everybody give me your wallets then. All of you! The gunman started grabbing wallets from the truckers, from Earl, from the tourists. Most people had maybe $60 to $80 cash. Not enough. The leader was getting more agitated, more desperate. Frank recognized the pattern. This wasn't professional. These were amateurs, probably needed money for drugs or debt. The kind of robbery that should be quick, in and out, but was dragging on too long, which meant they were going to make bad decisions. "We need more," the leader was saying to his partner. "This isn't enough. There's an ATM across the street. We can't wait that long. Someone's going to call the cops, so we take hostages, force them to withdraw. Or we hit another place. There's that gas station down the road. They were planning in front of witnesses." Another amateur mistake, which meant they probably weren't planning to leave witnesses. Frank's right hand, still hidden under the table, had stopped trembling entirely. Frank had been in hostage situations before, not as a hostage, but as the one resolving them. Iraq, 1991, during Desert Storm. Afghanistan, 2002, during early operations. Various other locations that were still classified even decades later. He'd learned that hostage situations followed patterns. There was a window, usually very brief, between when the hostage-takers established control and when they made their exit plan. That window was when intervention had the highest success rate and lowest casualty risk. Frank was currently in that window, maybe 90 seconds before these two men either fled or escalated. And based on their nervous energy, their increasing desperation, and their lack of professional planning, Frank calculated they were trending toward escalation. 8 civilians in the diner besides Frank. Cindy, Betty, Earl, 3 truckers, 2 tourists. 8 people who would be hurt or killed if this went wrong. Frank ran the tactical assessment the way he'd been trained 40 years ago. 2 armed subjects, 1 blocking the front door, primary exit, 1 mobile near the counter, currently controlling the civilians, both carrying revolvers, probably 6 rounds each, unknown if they had additional ammunition. The mobile subject was the primary threat, weapon drawn, finger on trigger, high stress level. The door subject was secondary, weapon holstered, more focused on watching outside than inside. Optimal intervention. Eliminate primary threat first, then secondary. Use speed and surprise to overcome age and physical limitations. Frank's right hand moved from his lap to the table, picked up his coffee cup with absolute steadiness. His left hand, the one that trembled, continued holding his newspaper, maintaining the image of a harmless elderly man. The leader was still arguing with his partner about what to do next. Their attention was divided, their situational awareness poor. If Frank was going to move, it would be now. But there was a problem. The trucker who'd mocked him earlier, the "can you move any slower" guy, was sitting in direct line of fire between Frank and the primary gunman. If Frank moved on the gunman, the trucker would almost certainly panic and get shot. Frank made a decision. He dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor with a crash, splashing hot coffee everywhere. Every head in the diner turned toward the noise. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Frank said, his voice elderly and apologetic. He started to stand up, movements slow and shaky. "I'll clean that up. I'm so clumsy. Sit down, old man," the leader shouted, swinging his gun toward Frank. Perfect. Now Frank was the focus of attention, everyone looking at him instead of the gunman. And the leader had just made the fatal mistake of pointing his weapon away from the other civilians. Frank's hand, which had been reaching toward his chest as if to steady himself, suddenly wasn't shaking at all. In one fluid motion that belonged to a much younger man, Frank pulled something from under his shirt. A snub-nose 3x57 revolver, carried in a shoulder holster, hidden under his flannel shirt. The weapon was old, but immaculately maintained. Frank had carried it for 40 years, through 3 wars and 2 decades of retirement. He'd hoped never to use it again. But hope was a luxury civilians had. Frank's training took over. 40 years of rust, but muscle memory ran deeper than time. He acquired his target, the leader 20 feet away, weapon pointed at Frank, and fired twice. Double tap. Center mass. The way he'd been trained, the leader went down immediately. The second gunman was reaching for his weapon when Frank's next 2 shots took him down as well. 4 shots. 2 seconds. 2 threats eliminated. Then Frank's hands started shaking again. The silence that followed the gunshots was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 8 civilians stared at the old man in the corner booth, who was now holding a revolver that still had smoke wisping from the barrel. Frank carefully set the weapon on the table, keeping his hands visible. "Someone call 911, he said quietly. "Tell them there's been a shooting at Betty's Diner. 2 suspects down, no civilian injuries. I'll stay on scene until law enforcement arrives." His voice was calm, professional, the same tone he'd used decades ago when reporting combat situations. But inside, Frank felt sick. He'd killed 2 men. After 40 years of civilian life, of morning coffee and quiet routines, he'd killed again. It had been necessary. They would have hurt these people. Frank had seen it in their eyes, in their escalating desperation. But necessary didn't make it easy. Cindy was the first to move, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. The tourists were crying. Earl looked like he might throw up. The truckers, including the one who'd mocked Frank earlier, were staring at him with expressions somewhere between shock and awe. Betty walked over to Frank's booth slowly. She looked at the gun, then at Frank, then at the 2 bodies on her diner floor. "You military?" she asked quietly. "Was. Long time ago." "Ranger tab on your keychain isn't decoration then." Frank glanced at his keys sitting on the table. He'd forgotten the small brass Ranger tab he'd carried for decades. Betty had noticed what no one else had. "No, ma'am. It's not decoration." Sheriff's deputies arrived within 8 minutes. Fast response for rural Montana. The sheriff himself, Tom Bridges, arrived 3 minutes after that. He found Frank sitting calmly in his booth, hands visible on the table, weapon placed in clear sight, not touching anything. "Frank Morrison?" Bridges approached carefully. He knew Frank by sight, the old guy who had coffee every morning, but clearly hadn't known anything else about him. "Yes, sir." "You want to tell me what happened here?" Frank gave a concise, factual report. Time of entry, description of suspects, their actions, his threat assessment, his decision to intervene. He sounded like he was debriefing a commanding officer, which is exactly what he was doing. Bridges listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. "You're telling me you shot both suspects?" "Yes, sir. 4 shots, all center mass." They're carrying .38 revolvers, probably 6 rounds each. Neither got a shot off after I engaged. And you're 78 years old. Yes, sir. Bridges looked at Betty. This accurate? Every word. Those boys came in waving guns, took our money, were getting ready to do something worse. Frank stopped them. Betty's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking as she poured herself coffee. He saved us. The investigation took hours. Statements from every witness. Crime scene photos. Forensic analysis. Frank cooperated fully, explaining that his weapon was legally registered, that he'd maintained his concealed carry permit even in retirement. What he didn't explain, what he'd learned not to volunteer, was exactly what kind of military service he'd had. He said Army Ranger and let people assume he'd been regular infantry. Better than explaining that he'd been part of special operations, that his 43 confirmed kills weren't accidents. The forensics backed up Frank's account completely. Both suspects had elevated methamphetamine levels in their systems. Both had prior records for armed robbery. The leader had an outstanding warrant for assault. This wasn't their first violent crime, and based on their behavior, it wouldn't have been their last. By afternoon, the story was all over local news. Elderly diner regular stops armed robbery. The headline made Frank sound like a lucky civilian who'd gotten a good shot off. Only the veterans who heard the story and noted the Army Ranger detail understood what had really happened. Frank was released after giving his statement. Sheriff Bridges walked him to his truck. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask. You live alone, right? Anyone we should notify about what happened?" "No family, Sheriff. It's just me." "Well, you might want to think about talking to someone. VA has counseling services. I'm familiar with the resources, sir. I'll be fine." Bridges nodded but looked unconvinced. "The county attorney will review the case, but this looks like clear self-defense. Justified use of lethal force. You probably won't face charges." "Understood. Still, killing someone, even when justified, that's not easy to carry." Frank looked at the sheriff directly. "I know, sir. I've been carrying it a long time." Frank didn't go to Betty's diner the next morning. For the first time in 15 years, he broke his routine. He stayed home, sitting in his small cabin on the edge of town, drinking coffee and trying not to think about 2 bodies on a diner floor. But by Saturday, the cabin walls felt too close. And Betty's was his place, his routine. He couldn't let 2 drug-addicted criminals take that from him. So Saturday morning at 6 a.m., Frank pulled into the parking lot of Betty's diner. Same spot, same walk to the door, same limp, same slow shuffle. But when he entered, everything was different. The diner was packed, every booth full, people standing. And when Frank walked in, they stood up, all of them, and they started clapping. Frank stopped in the doorway, confused and uncomfortable. He didn't want applause, didn't deserve it. He'd just done what needed doing. Betty came around the counter, and to Frank's shock, she hugged him. "You saved our lives, all of us." Earl, the mechanic, approached next. "Mr. Morrison, I've been having coffee next to you for 10 years. Never knew your name until I read it in the paper. I'm sorry for that." One by one, people came up to shake Frank's hand, to thank him, to apologize for treating him like he was invisible. The trucker who'd mocked him on Thursday was there, waiting until everyone else had finished. "Sir, I owe you an apology. What I said to you, you didn't know," Frank said quietly. "That's no excuse. You deserved respect whether you'd been military or not. Age doesn't make someone less valuable." Frank accepted the handshake accepted the apology, and finally made his way to Booth 7. There was a handwritten sign taped to the table. Reserved for Frank Morrison, American hero. Frank immediately pulled it down. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who had breakfast. But Cindy, who'd learned his full name for the first time when the sheriff used it, brought his coffee without being asked, and sat down across from him for the first time ever. Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something? That thing you did, shooting those men that fast, how did you learn that? Training. A long time ago. The paper said you were Army Rangers. Is that like Special Forces? Similar. Different mission set. Frank paused. Cindy, can I ask you something? Why does it matter now? Why is everyone treating me differently? She thought about it. Because we feel guilty. We saw you every day for years, and never really saw you. Never learned your name, never asked about your life. You were just the old guy. And then you saved our lives, and we realized we didn't even know the person who considered us worth saving. You were always worth saving. That doesn't change based on whether you knew my name. Maybe. But knowing your name makes you real. Makes us care about you instead of just serving you coffee. She stood up. Your breakfast is on the house today. And every day from now on. That's not necessary. Mr. Morrison, you've been leaving a 20% tip on a $4 breakfast for 15 years. That's 15% more than most customers. You've earned some free eggs. By Monday, the story had gone national. 78-year-old Army Ranger stops diner robbery. With a photo of Betty's diner and Frank's old military photo that someone had dug up from archived records. Frank's phone started ringing. His landline, which had sat silent for years, suddenly couldn't stop. News stations wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted him as a guest. Someone from Hollywood called about movie rights. Frank declined everything. He'd never sought attention in his military career, and he wasn't about to start in retirement. But one call he couldn't refuse came from an unexpected source. A staff sergeant from Fort Bragg calling on behalf of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Staff Sergeant Morrison? This is Staff Sergeant Mike Chen from 3rd Battalion. I know you're retired, sir, but the regiment would like to recognize your actions. You represented Ranger values, courage, honor, decisive action in the face of danger. We'd like to present you with an updated service coin if you'd accept it. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Sergeant, I haven't worn the uniform in 40 years. I'm not sure I deserve recognition. Sir, with respect, you stopped wearing the uniform, but you never stopped being a ranger. What you did in that diner, that's exactly what we train for. Protecting others, using minimum necessary force, accepting the weight of hard decisions. The regiment is proud to claim you. Frank felt something break open in his chest, a wall he'd built decades ago to separate his military life from his civilian one. I'd be honored, Sergeant. The ceremony was small, held at Betty's diner at Frank's request. 20 Rangers drove from Fort Bragg to rural Montana. They wore their dress uniforms, stood at attention, and presented Frank with a Ranger coin in front of the same people who'd ignored him for 15 years. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel young enough to be Frank's grandson, spoke about the Ranger creed. I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. He looked at Frank. Staff Sergeant Morrison interpreted comrade broadly. His fellow Americans eating breakfast in a diner. He didn't leave them. He didn't abandon them. He stood up when it mattered. Frank accepted the coin with hands that shook until he closed them around the metal. Then, like they always did when he needed them to be, His hands went steady. 6 months later, Frank Morrison still had coffee at Betty's Diner every morning at 6 a.m. Same booth, same order, same routine. But now people knew his name. They sat with him, asked him questions, treated him like the person he'd always been, but they'd never bothered to see. Frank didn't talk much about his military service. He'd answer questions if asked directly, but he preferred to listen, to hear about people's lives, their families, their struggles, the things he'd missed while being invisible. One morning, a young man in an army uniform came into the diner, fresh-faced, probably just finished basic training, on leave before his first deployment. He spotted Frank's Ranger tab keychain and approached nervously. "Sir, I saw the news story about you. I'm heading to RASP next month, Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. Do you have any advice?" Frank looked at this young soldier, so eager, so proud, saw himself at 18, before the wars, before the wait. Never forget why you're doing it. You're not training to be dangerous. You're training to protect people who can't protect themselves. That purpose, that's what gets you through. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." After the soldier left, Cindy refilled Frank's coffee. "You're good with them. The young ones who come in wearing uniforms. They respect you. They respect the uniform I wore. I'm just the man who survived wearing it. That's more than most people can say." Frank thought about the 2 men he'd killed in this diner. They'd been someone's sons, maybe someone's brothers. They'd made terrible choices, but they'd been human. That weight never left, no matter how justified the action, but neither did the weight of responsibility. 8 people had gone home to their families that night because Frank had been willing to carry that burden. 8 lives that continued because he'd remembered his training, kept his skills sharp even in retirement, and refused to be the helpless old man people assumed he was. Betty came out from the kitchen, slid into the booth across from Frank. "I've been meaning to ask you something. Why'd you come back? After what happened, you could have started having breakfast somewhere else. Gone somewhere people didn't know. This is my place. Those criminals didn't get to take that from me." Frank paused. "Besides, where else am I going to get eggs this good?" Betty smiled. "You're welcome here every day for the rest of your life, Frank Morrison. On the house, I'll still tip 20%. I wouldn't expect anything less." Frank finished his breakfast, left his usual tip, and walked slowly to his truck. His legs still hurt. His hands still shook when he wasn't concentrating. He was still 78 years old, still moving slower than he used to, but he wasn't invisible anymore. And more importantly, he'd proven, to himself as much as anyone, that getting old didn't mean becoming helpless. Age might slow the body, but it couldn't touch the things that mattered. Courage, skill, the willingness to act when others froze. Frank drove home through the Montana morning, the sunrise painting the mountains gold. He'd lived a long time, carried heavy burdens, made hard choices, but he'd also protected people, saved lives, earned respect, not through violence, but through the courage to use it only when necessary. That was a life worth living, even if it took 78 years for people to notice. So now I ask you, have you ever dismissed someone because of their age? Have you overlooked the elderly person sitting quietly in the corner, assuming they had nothing to offer? Have you learned too late that the people we ignore are sometimes the ones with the most to give? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the forgotten veterans, the invisible elders, the people whose value you discovered only after they proved it in ways you couldn't ignore. If this story moved you, subscribe to Open Book Stories. We publish powerful narratives about those whose society overlooks, those whose strength runs deeper than appearance suggests, and those who prove that heroes come in every age. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, respect isn't something you earn by proving yourself. It's something everyone deserves, regardless of age, appearance, or the speed at which they move.